Welcome to the MyCom Screencast. My name is Seiberling, and today I'm going to talk about how you can improve the design of your church communication materials. So the first thing that you really need to do is you need to take every last piece of communication materials and start to ask, what is the impression that it makes? How does it look? What would someone who doesn't belong to this church, if they walked in the first time, how would they feel? It's really important to be able to just take an objective eye and look at it and really just say, how can we do this better? And the reason we need to do that really comes from Luke 15, verses 1 through 7. And there, Jesus talks about the parable of the lost sheep. It tells us where to really focus our attention. And it's not about the 99 people that we have in church, but it's about the one person who's out and how we really reach out to them in a relevant and meaningful way. So in terms of, what are the age groups? What's the family situation, the income, some of the beliefs, and even what their style is? It's just really understanding who they are and what connects with them. And then second, what we really need to do is also understand the character of the church. And so when we think about, who we are, it even comes down to things like our building. And we can't go out and remodel the entire building. In order to do that, and that gives an impression of who we are. So if your church was built in 1905 and it's this beautiful old style Gothic cathedral, you could try to make it as contemporary as you want, but the building's still going to give you a very, what I'll say, vintage feel. Second, your regular attenders. So what is just the feel and the vibe of whether it's your worship service or just the people who attend? You also need to understand your culture. Are you a more, what I'd say, traditional or formal culture? Is it more of a casual culture and so on? And finally, I think this is really the most important, is what is the unique calling for your church? And so when we understand who we're trying to reach and we understand kind of what our natural state is, how do we start to really manage that intersection that is both authentic and relevant, not only to what people care about, but who God calls our church to be? And so when we understand that, then we can move forward in the design process. So here we're going to give a case study. It's a church called Wapakoneta First United Methodist, and this is in a rural community in Ohio. Now, in this community, they've got high educational attainment, there are higher income levels and lower poverty levels. It's a very homogeneous community. From a psychographic standpoint, it's really about importance of family. There's growing use of technology, but there's also a low commitment to religious institutions. While they're traditional in many senses, this idea that I need, that church is an important part of my life wasn't necessarily there. Now, from a church standpoint, it was changing, and it was seen as a country club church, but was really growing in engagement with the community. And there's a new vibrancy with the new pastor and a growing emphasis on kids. And then there was a strong community pride. So, how do we make that connection? And so what's interesting is we've got young families in the community. We've got a young pastor that's very kids engaged. But then when we look at the communication materials, does that reflect that intersection? And the answer was no. And so here are just a few simple ways that you can really improve your designs. So first, pick one main color. And what's really interesting here, that there's a whole psychology to color, where red is really stimulating and vibrant and passionate. Black is around exclusive, prestigious, luxurious. What really fits who we are as a church, but also what connects well with the community. And for First Church, they really were looking at red. Their church was becoming very vibrant, very active, and so red really seemed to fit. The other pieces, some of the supporting colors, really ended up focusing on primary. And the decision was made to do that because of the importance of children. The other thing that was interesting was it wasn't being used by any other church or other community organizations. Once you pick a color, go and take a look and make sure that you can own that color. So the second thing we do after we've picked a color is we have to pick fonts. Fonts evoke feelings the same way colors do. There's a couple different types of font. One is serif, and this was the traditional beginning font when they did typesetting. And so what you see is the little points that come off the letters. It feels very traditional and respectable and reliable. Whereas sans serif fonts, those don't have those little points coming off of them. It's more clean and modern and objective. But there's some other kinds of fonts too. There's one which is called modern. What you see is the traditional serif font, but it's thinner in some parts. And so it gives a little bit, whether it's stronger or progressive or stylish or chic look. Then there's script and handwriting. It gives an elegant or affectionate or even expressive and fun view. And then finally, there's something which is called display or decorative fonts. And these are fonts that are really, I think, seen more as designed a different way that you could go with fonts. And so you can search any of them on Google Fonts and so on and download them. These are the main descriptors on there, so you can find which font works for you. Now, there's some basic rules for fonts. And these will be linked in the show notes. But what you really want to do is you want to have a mix of fonts. So you want like a sans serif with a serif font, or a serif font with a sans serif font. You don't want two similar looking fonts. And what you really want is contrast. You only want two fonts. You very rarely, if ever, need three. How do I take and use one font for my titles and my headlines and use the other for body copy? Because what that'll do is that'll drive consistency. There are also some fonts that should just be avoided. Comic Sans is one of them. There are others. And then finally, make sure you're legal. Google Fonts are all open source. So websites like Font Squirrel or DaFont, just check and see whether it's available for free for commercial use or not. Now for First Church, we picked two fonts. The first one we picked was Architect's Daughter, which is a display type font. It was seen as playful and interesting and kind of connecting with kids. But then we focused on readability and contrast for the subhead and the body copy, and we used Segogi UI, both either semi-bold for subheadings and semi-light for body text. And it also fit with the red and the vibrancy and the playfulness, and we also had that Architect's Daughter, and it really became an ownable element for our church. Next, what you need to do is you need to create a consistent visual element. There are a couple ways to do this. These samples came from canva.com, but if you go to other design sites, they'll be there as well. I ended up boiling it down to a couple different shapes. So if you look at the ones on the far left, it's really based on a rectangle. And so you can use that as creative element, whether it's the back of text, whether it's the center and semi-transparent. But you can see if you have that, you can put it across all the different materials and it creates consistency. You could pick a circle and really focus on circles as your main element, but just use them in the same way. You can't say I'm doing circles and I do it 3 different ways. Pick one and stick with it. Or, pick a triangle element. Here you see a couple different ways to use triangles. Or you can even get a little bit more fancy and go with, let's say, a grid or a grid picture format, or even paintbrush. Just pick one. Keep it simple, and that's why sometimes rectangles and circles are better than grid or paintbrush. Now back to our example for First United Methodist Church, we have our color, we have our fonts, and we just used a red rectangle to back our titles in. Took those 3 elements and we created templates for each of the major material types to really create a consistent look. And here's what they look like. So we always used a picture on the top 2/3, and we looked for something that was fun and exciting or relevant to the people we're trying to reach. So you see the back to school bash, it isn't just a kid with a backpack and school supplies, but he's like, yeah, and just excited. If you look at the new here, instead of using a picture, we actually use the cutout. Or even just welcome to First Church, it's a place to grow. And notice it's multi-generational and different kind of people's hands all together. All of these pictures are stock photos, and there are a lot of inexpensive stock photo sites. Really this comes down to, we ask the question again, does this redesign connect our church to our community? And as you look at it, you can really start to see that, yeah, it's consistent, it's exciting, it's interesting, and it looks really good. Again, those are just a few simple steps that you can use. Now, the last part is there are some design rules that you could use as well. Really, there are 4 ways in order to drive good design. So the left is the kind of the original, the right is the redesigned one. So the first one is contrast. It's avoid elements that look very similar. And if you look at the one on the left, it all kind of runs together. The fonts are the same. It's just kind of centered. It doesn't seem to have much pop. But if we look at the right, pop. The second is repetition. And so what you see is, the headline is a different color. It's a different font. Kind of the subheading or the body is a different font. Even if we created something else, you just keep creating that visual language for people to follow. Third thing is around alignment, especially in churches when we center everything. And instead, right justify it, left justify it, play with it a little bit. But, how are you creating some basic lines in your materials? Because it just looks cleaner, it looks neater, and people understand it. And the last one is proximity. That when you look at the left, you got pick one color and then pick a color that reflects your church. And everything is just bunched together. And instead, what we did is we picked an item, pick one main color, and then, pick a color that reflects your church, and it's close together, but then we create white space. And the bottom line is white space is your friend. It's not that hard in order to create a new design for your church. It takes a little work though, so trial and error. Don't hesitate to just give it a whirl and keep working until you can find something that everyone loves. So that's it for this United Methodist Screencast. As always, feel free to send me any questions at eric@brokensheep.com or make a comment below. Thank you so much, and see you next time.